and welcome everyone to the Good Food Institute's webinar on our resource, Sensory Evaluation of Alternative Proteins. My name is Nikita Mansukani Kogar, and I'm a principal plant-based scientist on GFI's Science and Technology team. I'll be providing an introduction before passing it over to my co-presenter and lead author on this report, Alyssa Nolden, who's an associate professor of food science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and an expert in sensory science and sensory evaluation of alternative proteins. So today we'll take you through the key highlights of the report, starting with a very brief introduction, an overview of the report, some deep dive highlights of particular importance, and finally a few frequently asked questions and final recommendations. We'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions, and a reminder to please use the Q&A box for any questions, as we may be able to answer some in the chat as we go through that Q&A box, but mostly we'll answer those at the end. So for those not yet familiar with us, the Good Food Institute is a nonprofit think tank developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We're completely powered by philanthropy, and our mission is in advancing alternative proteins as an essential solution needed to meet the world's climate, global health, food security, and biodiversity goals. We have three key areas of focus to drive our work. First, our science and technology team works to advance foundational, open access research in alternative proteins and create a thriving research and training ecosystem. Next, our corporate engagement team partners with companies and investors across the globe to drive investment, accelerate innovation, and scale the supply chain. And last, our policy team advocates for fair policy and public research funding for alternative proteins. We're listed as a top recommended charity by evaluators such as Charity Navigator and have earned Candid's Platinum Seal of Transparency, reflecting our commitment to maximum impact, efficiency, and inclusion. If you're interested in supporting more events like this and all of GFI's work to advance the alternative protein ecosystem, please contact philanthropy@gfi.org. We are a global organization with over 200 staff in 7 regions, and together we work as a force multiplier to bring expertise to the rest of the world, like this guide here. So before going any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone that contributed to the report because there are so many. So thank you to everyone from GFI, our authors Claire and Jody, as well as our lead author Alyssa from UMass Amherst, as well as Caroline Cotto, Director of Nectar, who served as a technical advisor on this project, and the many people who responded to our interviews or survey requests. This report is comprised of a full white paper, very in-depth, and a much shorter quick start guide for easy access, sharing, and posting. For the downloads, you can visit our website here, and we will dive in a little bit here today. So first, a brief introduction and motivation for alternative proteins and this report. So the challenge that we're trying to meet is that industrial meat, egg, and dairy production is unsustainable, inefficient, and the driver of many of our most pressing challenges like climate change, environmental degradation, and antibiotic resistance. Despite the inefficiencies of the system and despite growing awareness, meat production continues to increase, primarily driven by factory farming. This graph shows global meat production from 1961 to present day with projected growth out to 2050, and there's no signs of slowing down. And that's where GFI's approach comes in. So we're working to accelerate alternative proteins because we believe we can create meat and dairy in a more sustainable way rather than asking consumers to give up the foods that they love. That brings us to the alternative protein landscape, which is outlined here. So with plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation technologies, we can produce meat without the animal. Plant-based meat uses plants like soy or pea as the raw protein ingredients. Cultivated meat uses animal cells, and fermentation leverages microorganisms to produce specific ingredients or protein biomass. However, consumers who have tried alternative proteins, specifically plant-based meat in this case, or who have tried it but stopped eating it cite taste, texture, and preference for conventional meat among the top reasons that they don't eat it. So according to our consumer research insights from 2023, the top reason lapsed plant-based meat consumers said they would return to the category is if it matched the taste and texture of conventional meat. Over and over, we see taste and price as the main drivers of consumer acceptance, and sensory parity as the most effective way to mass consumer adoption. Also last year, Nectar released the largest open access sensory analysis of plant-based meat, which shows us even more that taste is both the main driver of consumer preference and adoption. And while, of course, there are significant technical challenges to overcome to reach sensory parity, it's equally critical that the industry has consistent, reliable methods of measuring the efficacy of those technical advancements and make sure product development is working towards consumer preference. So that's where sensory science comes in. Sensory science, the science of using the human senses, provides the tools to evaluate and optimize taste and the overall eating experience, enabling the industry to develop products that meet or exceed consumer expectations. It's often understood as a subjective discipline, but it's a rigorous scientific discipline that applies experimental design and statistical analysis to produce product insights. It's important to distinguish this from instrumental analysis. Instruments can give us data, but they cannot fully replicate the human experience. Sensory science is also distinct from, yet very closely related to consumer science. Sensory science focuses on product characteristics, also referred to as attributes, under controlled conditions, while consumer science investigates how those attributes drive liking, preference, and behavior in real-world contexts. The two disciplines are complementary and sometimes overlap, and we'll be discussing elements today, a little bit of both, but mostly focused on sensory science. Alternative proteins also face unique hurdles that make this science indispensable. First is flavor. The flavor of meat is shaped by the complex interplay of Maillard reactions, lipid oxidation, and species-specific compounds that are difficult to mimic. Alternative proteins, on the other hand, deal with off notes like beany, grassy, or metallic flavors derived from plant or microorganism proteins. Second is texture. So replicating the fiber structure of muscle is very difficult given all of the micro and macro elements that are involved and the inherent differences in structure and functionality between plant and animal or microbe proteins. Finally, visual cues and expectations. We know we eat with our eyes. If a product looks like a burger, consumers expect it to taste like beef. With alternative proteins, though, misaligned expectations can lead to rejection before even the first bite. On top of it all, there are consumer factors that must be considered, such as demographics, emotion, and perception of new foods, given the central role of meat in many food cultures. And these special considerations are active areas of research. Because of these challenges, sensory testing can't just be a final check before launch. It must be integrated throughout the development cycle and play a central role in driving product development decisions. Early testing helps screen prototypes, mid-stage testing refines formulation and consistency, and later stage testing validates market readiness. This integration minimizes costly missteps and ensures you're constantly aligning with consumer expectations. Further, in our research, for several interviewees cited examples of competitive advantages as a result of integrating sensory evaluation into all steps of product development. Developing sensory literacy in teams provides several advantages, including improved decision-making, enhanced cross-functional collaboration, and building internal capability and innovation. While many groups do recognize the importance of sensory evaluation, current practices remain inconsistent, and it's difficult to implement sensory evaluation throughout the development process. So with that in mind, we put together this best practices guide to offer an applied guide aligned with product development needs in the alternative protein industry. It addresses special consideration for sensory evaluation of alternative proteins with advice tailored to an emerging industry with sometimes limited resources. Its main purpose is providing a roadmap to integrate sensory science more effectively into innovation pipelines for alternative protein success. And with that in mind, let's officially dive in. So this guide that we're releasing today and talking about in our session, it brings together foundational concepts, practical guidance, and emerging innovations in sensory science for alternative proteins. It's designed to serve a wide range of readers, from those new to sensory science to technical specialists looking for more detailed guidance. Here's a very brief overview of the main section headers and when they might be most useful. We won't be going through every single detail today or even every single section, so I definitely recommend downloading the full report and accompanying quick start guide. Briefly, though, the white paper covers how to get started with sensory evaluation, including how to define a question, core sensory methods that are field standard and emerging sensory methods, how sensory evaluation supports each stage of product development, practical guidance for study setup, participant recruitment, sample prep and controls, guidance on interpreting and presenting data, including assessing sensory parity. Finally, new approaches, technologies, and opportunities shaping the future of sensory evaluation of alternative proteins. And last, frequently asked questions style insights into frequent challenges and misconceptions. So some sections are designed for beginners in sensory science, but there's important information for those already familiar with the field or in the field themselves, including several interviewee and survey insights that ground this report in real-world perspective and practice. So I'd encourage you to take a look at both the full white paper and the quick start guide, which is just a 4 or 5 page distillation of everything in there and includes some really interesting case studies, which we're going to dive into further today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Alyssa to take us through some of the highlights of the report.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're joining us. Thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. And I'm really excited to get a little bit deeper into our quick start guide. So just another introduction. My name is Dr. Nolden. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Food Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, specializing in sensory evaluation. And as I work through some of the highlights of the report, we're going to first start with some traditional methods used in sensory. But before I begin, I'd just like to take another minute to say thank you for all of those who have helped so far with this report, and a special thank you for all of those who spent time with me talking about their expertise and best practices when it comes to sensory evaluation in the alternative protein space. I enjoy talking to each and every one of you. And while there are some differences in everyone having their unique experiences, that perspective is embedded into this best practice guide and help to strengthen the report, but also reinforce the importance of sensory evaluation and the critical role that it plays in the development of alternative proteins. So thank you very much for that. So as I mentioned, we'll get started with first taking a quick overview of the traditional sensory methods. So there are 3 classical or traditional sensory methods: discrimination, descriptive, and effective. These 3 are distinct classifications based on the question that they intend to answer. So here, the question, are the products different, are linked with discrimination tests. And we'll go through examples of each of these tests in the following slides. The next question is, how are the products different? These are embedded in the descriptive analysis tests. And lastly, asking the question, are the products liked and how much? And this is our classification of effective tests. And you can see from the beginning how important it is to align the method that you're used to the question that you have related to your development of your product. So we're going to go through each of these methods in more detail. The first, we're going to take a deep dive into discrimination testing. And again, that's asking the question, are these products different? That's best used when you want to confirm that there's a change or whether or not participants can identify a change between two products. This might be when you're introducing a new ingredient supplier or you're comparing differences in processing location, and you want to confirm that it has not altered your product. Some of the most common discrimination methods shown here, triangle test, tetrad test, and ABX, help to answer this question, are the products different? The most common method that you might have heard of is the triangle test. Uh, you're given three samples. One is different, and two are the same. And participants are asked to identify the odd sample. Another common method is a tetrad test. This is four samples with two pairs of samples. And again, participants are asked to sort the samples based on similarity or the two samples that match. The last example here is ABX. You're given a sample, unknown sample X, and a reference sample A and B. And you're asking participants to match whether or not the unknown sample is more similar to A or more similar to B. There's also opportunities to make this directional. So you could ask, what is the sweeter sample, for example, rather than just which sample is different. An important aspect of this test is that you are not, in the instance where samples are determined to be just not different, it is inappropriate to conclude that they are the same, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So for this, you want to also make sure that there's no obvious difference between your samples before you get started. If you and your team can look at the samples, there's visual differences, or you can taste clearly different differences between the two products, your best option is to move away from a discrimination test and maybe go to descriptive. It's important to think about who your participants are for your test. It can be appropriate to use employees, but with caution. Oftentimes, our own employees are more sensitive to differences between products. And if employees are capable of noticing a difference, you have to validate whether or not consumers have that same perspective. So you also want to make sure that descriptive tests are not going to be that useful in identifying where the differences lie, only that there's a difference exists. For a traditional descriptive or discrimination test, when asking the question, are the products different? You typically want to use 30 to 50 participants, helping to provide enough sample size to conclude that there is or is not a difference. However, if your goal is to conclude that the products are the same, you'll need to move to a similarity test. For this study, you would want to reach upwards of 300 or more participants to be able to have enough evidence or enough power to be able to conclude that the samples are the same. And an example of how you might translate this to the real world is by flipping a coin. So we know that flipping a coin is 50-50 heads or tails. However, out of 10 to 30 flips, we might not actually realize this 50-50 split. And it's only with flipping a coin hundreds or thousands of times that you actually get to that 50-50 chance. And so it is, again, want to reinforce that if your participants fail to reach significance, meaning you conclude that there's no difference between the sample, you cannot make the translation to say that the products are the same. So if you have a question about how these products are different, you might want to move towards a descriptive testing. And just to foreshadow, this is by far the most popular test that experts described using in their companies. So descriptive test is another classification helping to answer the question about how the products are different. And there's a couple of different methods that are most common in the industry. It helps to characterize the full profile of the product and helping to identify and quantify off notes or maybe specific mouthfeel attributes. It's best practice to compare prototypes to benchmark products and in some cases, animal counterparts. It can be useful in identifying where the difference lies and how large that difference is. But it is important that when running this test, you're not asking these same participants how much they like the product. Traditionally, we might use around 10 to 12 highly trained individuals where they're very familiar with the attributes or the product category that you're interested in. The main difference between some of these methods is whether or not the attributes are um, given in advance to a participant group. In some cases, you might provide the participants with a product and allow them to naturally generate the main attributes that drive the differences across the products. So for the results for something like a descriptive analysis, we might want to use a lexicon. And so we might have a predetermined list of attributes that we might be interested in. It is important to identify what list of attributes are most important to your product group. Um, in some cases, you might also want to provide references for consumers. Some attributes might not be familiar, and things like barnyard, metallic, earthy, you can have references for participants to sample. It is pretty common to use internal employees for this. However, it is noted that some of our experts did have challenges in running internal panels due to availability or changes in employment, and that can be challenging to navigate. And so having reliable and accessible participants or panelists is important for running internal descriptive analysis. The last method that I'm going to describe as part of the three classifications is effective testing. And this method really asks the questions, are these products liked and how much? This can be useful at any stage of development. It can identify which prototype should advance. It can be to evaluate consumer acceptance before moving to launching a product. But it also can be helpful in assessing, is this product comparable to leading commercial products or conventional animal products? For asking whether or not consumers like a product, we really want to make sure that the consumers in our study represent the target market and are on a larger size. So traditionally, we target around 80 to 100 participants. However, we might go larger depending on the questions that we have related to our product. Traditionally, we might run something called the central location test, where we're in a controlled setting and we can control the lights, the sounds, and provide a standardized sample presentation to our participants. However, we might also want to move towards something called a home use test. We might have specific questions about how a consumer interacts with the product, how they experience cooking, and that's where we can use consumers in their home where they can explore the product in their own kitchen. Again, we really need to make sure that when we're setting up and designing the study, that the consumers in our study represent the target market. Making sure that when we're asking effective tests or hedonic acceptance, that we're not using our own employees or stakeholders, as they are really invested in the outcome, and it can bias or mislead the results. There are a couple different methods that you might want to utilize when asking questions around consumer liking. The most common method that we use in the industry is the 9-point hedonic scale you can see here on the top of the screen. This is a 9-point scale that goes from dislike extremely to like extremely, and has been a very powerful tool in the industry. The second most popular approach might be the just about right scale. This combines overall liking with a direction of a specific attribute, and examples are listed here below. It could be something around how much do you like the color? Is it too weak? Is it too strong? How much do you like the saltiness? And it goes on. So this type of method not only can give you some information on how well it's liked, but gives some direction on if I need to make adjustments, which attribute do I need to adjust? Last, we see ranking tests are pretty popular. However, we want to make sure that when ranking, that the products that we're ranking are actually liked. We do not want to draw conclusions that even though a product was ranked number one, that it is in fact a well-liked product. So we also want to think about some more novel methods. We consider these rapid or novel sensory methods, and they can be used to identify attributes among categories of products. So we heard from our panelists in our interviews that flash and free choice profiling was becoming a more popular method um, and transitioning away from descriptive analysis. So here we can use untrained or trained panelists to describe products independently and assign intensity. This can be advantageous with employees and not having to invest a lot of time in training. Check all that apply. We can identify specific attributes that we're interested in, and participants have the option of selecting the attribute that they're experiencing for that product. A very similar approach is rate all that apply. So after you check a specific attribute, you can continue on and rate the intensity of that specific attribute. Napping is a sorting classification where participants can arrange samples in a physical space without the need to be trained on specific attributes. And all of these examples have been utilized in spaces where you're trying to assess the current market space and how your prototype might compare contrast to the existing products in the market. So we're going to take take a minute to go through an example of a sorting task. And so in this example, we have eight samples, and imagine two of those samples being duplicates. And so participants are asked to sort or move these products in a physical space based on their similarity and differences. So products sorted together in a similar cluster are perceived to have similar attributes, and the distance in this case is meaningful. So products that are sorted farther away are more distinct. And so we can have participants sort without the need to have in-depth training on the specific attributes, especially where something like mouthfeel can be very difficult. Once they're done sorting, and we actually can confirm that the replicates that we have in the test are sorted in the same group, that participants can add descriptions as to what makes this group unique or how they clustered these samples away from another. Another common method that we're seeing utilized a lot in the industry is the temporal method. So going back to the previous example of check all that apply, you can actually perform a check all that apply over time. And this has been very valuable for products that have a dynamic change in their attribute. So if you can imagine something like creaminess or stringency, those profiles traditionally change as from first bite all the way through to swallowing. So these temporal methods have been very insightful, providing at what time point do we need to have an intervention. So we can have participants select all the attributes throughout the period of eating. We also can have participants select the dominant sensation that they're experiencing. So that would be the TDS example. So now that we've gone through a couple of examples of the common methods that are used in sensory evaluation, we also need to make sure that how do we decide which method we want to use? And again, this is going to be tied to the specific objective. We can see that there may be different objectives throughout the product development profile. So here are just some examples. When you're thinking about concept development, where your goal might be to establish a baseline in the market, you might think about running a focus group or concept testing. And for prototype development, where you have several early prototypes and you want to identify the leading product, you could consider rapid profiling. For product optimization, where you might have the goal to evaluate liking. For scaling up, you want to make sure that there are no differences across batches or across production location. Discrimination tests might be ideal. However, before moving towards commercialization, you really want to make sure you are running your hedonic test with a large number of consumers from your target audience. However, even after you launch your product, you want to make sure that you continuously monitor using discrimination or maybe a descriptive test. So although these external studies can be expensive, we did hear that one expert described upwards costs of $30,000 per product that you're testing for every for every 50 consumers that you might be interested in. And so that might mean that any of these tests might be thousands or tens of thousands of dollars investment. However, these costs provide a rigorous data to drive business decisions that can be offset by commercial performance and are often far more economical than ramifications of failed products. So this is especially crucial for gathering consumer data and using companies' employees as stages throughout this process. So when thinking about trying to make decisions and using your information to drive business decisions on development, you also need to make sure that you're including comparisons, controls, or benchmarks in every one of your sensory tests. And the decision on what type of benchmarks or controls that you might want to include um, is going to be really driven on the individual company and your overall goal. So as Nikki described early on, um, there's evidence to suggest that sensory parity is ideal, and that might be making sure that there's no difference between an animal product. So you might want to include a leading commercial animal product in your studies as a benchmark. However, it's really common, and especially with concerns around willingness to consume animal products, you might be relying on leading commercial products in the alternative protein space. You also want to make sure you have consistencies in the prototypes that you're using so you can compare across studies. And it's most useful to assess iterative process and scale up. However, it's not it's important to not only select the product, but confirm that it is a well-liked product when selecting your benchmark. And so when you're thinking about selecting either one of these animal products or a leading alternative protein products, you want to confirm that it is well liked. So here we have an example of an animal control, alternative control, and prototype A and B. And here we have their performance rated on a 9-point hedonic scale. So we might look at this result and quickly conclude that A and B are both well liked than both the animal control and the alternative commercial control. However, a closer look at this data would show that our control that we included in the study were not well liked. And so we want to make sure that when making comparisons across products that we have a well liked and reliable control in our study. So for something like this, we want to rethink the selection of our animal and alternative protein control and make sure that when making comparisons to our prototypes, we're making the correct comparison. We also got insights from our interviewees that selecting these controls, especially the alternative commercial control, can be especially challenging. In a market where things are rapidly changing, even selecting a reliable commercial control, you want to make sure that the performance is consistent even across studies. As we know, companies are regularly making changes and improvements to their products. So one of the most insightful experiences of doing the interviews was the discussion around sensory parity. And so we know that it can be important to evaluate sensory parity. However, it became very apparent early on with the interviewees, with interviews, that there was no alignment with how to define sensory parity. However, there was an agreement on how you might best assess with a sensory study. So most often we might think of sensory parity of having a product that is not different from an animal counterpart. So if this is your goal, where you can have no difference to a conventional animal product, there was strong agreement that the best practice was to run a discrimination test. However, in following up and continuing the conversation, this was generally not recommended from our experts. So it was mentioned that earlier on when running a discrimination test, if products are easily discriminable, it is not best practice to recommend this discrimination test. And so instead, it is recommended that you might want to move towards an effective test, asking the question, is the product not different in liking compared to a leading commercial alternative, a leading commercial animal counterpart? However, it is also pretty common that your consumers might not be interested in consuming an alternative commercial animal product, and you might want to include an effective test with a leading commercial alternative product. The third option is similarity testing, but based on our conversations, it is rarely used as it is resource intensive, as we mentioned, more than 300 participants to be able to conclude that the products are the same. So we also have given some examples for three of these traditional sensory methods in our quick start guide. So we have three case studies to share with you, each giving an example of discrimination, descriptive, and effective. So we're going to jump right in to our first case study where we ask the question, can consumers tell a difference between our chicken nuggets? So we might have two chicken nuggets, our prototype, and a leading alternative protein product or a leading commercial animal product. And we're going to present one product that is the same, one product that's different, and two products the same, and ask the participants to select the odd sample out. And in this example, if we had a group of 30 of our participants complete this task, we would need to have 15 or more participants to select the odd sample out to make a conclusion that our prototype is significantly different from our control product. So for this, you might represent your data this way based on the number of correct responses. And for this, you would use binomial statistics to make sure enough people pick the odd sample out to conclude that the products are statistically different. However, in this case, they're not different, so no difference was detected. However, as we mentioned before, this information isn't going to tell you where how to make improvements or why the product was perceived as different. And again, we wouldn't conclude that the samples are the same in this example. For our second case study, we have a descriptive example asking the question, are these products different? So here we have an example where we're trying to understand the sensory landscape and what are the key flavor and texture profiles of market leading in the milk category. So we will include both plant-based milk and conventional animal milk and ask participants to complete a flash profiling method. And again, for this, we don't have to have specific attributes in mind, but we ask untrained participants to sample a range of our products and ask them to generate their own descriptors and then rate them. It is clear that when thinking about the category of plant-based milk, you're going to have potentially 50 to 100 different products that are unrealistic to sample across in a single setting. So you're going to want to compare across days and making sure that you have a consistent product that's across every single session, allowing you to be able to combine across days. And a good check would be to how reliable is one individual at rating that control product across days. This would be performed between 50 to 20 untrained individuals. And again, this can be a great option to include your own employees. The output of this data, we might look like something like a spider plot where we can map the attributes of all of our participants on their intensity. And it can give you a quick insight into how the leading commercial product might compare to a prototype or opportunities to provide something unique in that space. So you can actually take this information and further analyze it using something called principal component analysis to identify opportunities for new products. However, this method or approach won't tell you which product is liked. And so if you have identified a specific product that you're trying to replicate, you want to maybe confirm with the consumers that indeed this product is something we want to match based on driving liking. Our last example for our case study is an effective test. And this method again is asking the questions, are the product liked and how much? And so for this case study, we have the question of, is our plant-based meatball liked as much as conventional meatball? So we want to run an affected test, and we're using a 9-point hedonic scale in this example. And samples would be presented one at a time and a randomized order with a 3-digit binding code. And participants would rate liking on specific attributes. There might be specific mouthfeel that you're interested in identifying, but also making sure to include overall liking. So for this, again, we're going to target around 80 to 100 of our target consumers. And so first, before analyzing the data, you want to check for normalization. Here, we show an example of a bimodal distribution where we can see we have a lot of individuals rating something on the dislike side, where we have equal number of individuals maybe rating something a little bit higher, like an 8 on a 9-point hedonic scale. So if we were to only look at the mean of this data, we might conclude that the overall liking is a 6, which is kind of a little bit higher than neither like nor dislike. However, it's clear when looking at this distribution, we have two groups, and this indicates potential consumer segmentation. However, once we check for this normal distribution, we can go ahead and compare overall liking between our two products. So for example, we might compare the overall liking of our plant-based meatball to our beef meatball. And in this case, we see our beef meatball was liked more than our plant-based meatball. So for here, you might want to follow up with this in terms of what might be driving the differences and liking. However, right now, our plant-based meatball would need to go for further refinement before launching. So those are 3 of our case studies that we have in our report, and can go and take a look at those and also provides a little bit more details into how you might analyze the data and report that to your group. However, in our last example, we foreshadowed a little bit of our consumer segmentation. We realized that this critical factor on this group differences within our target market is really important to provide insight onto reasons why consumers might be interested, why they have tried it but haven't tried again, or consumers who are reluctant to try. What's driving those reasons? And so this consumer segmentation is really important to better understand our target audience, but also to better align our products to our consumers. So we can think about studies that examine factors of driving consumer perception and choices beyond the features of the product itself, and try to identify those factors ahead of time when screening our participants. So in a rapidly growing area of research, it's important to think about what are important considerations other than does it taste good? So we have identified a much longer list in the report, but here we've provided a quick snapshot of the leading factors that have been associated with either sensory attributes or behavior around alternative protein. So we know that demographics such as age, education, location, something like accessibility, is it available where you are, or even how much money or your household income. We can think about how familiar you are with the product category itself. We know that prior experience with a product category or frequency of exposure is related to overall acceptance. And we can also think about, well, if you've tried it and had a negative experience, how that might relate to your perception of that product that we're tasting. Other things that might be important to look at are your values. So thinking about how important is sustainability, how important are your food choices related to nutrition or health. We know that animal welfare concern can be an important aspect. One thing that I found in my own research is how important acceptance of consuming these products are by your family and friends. And the example I always give is, are you comfortable with bringing your plant-based hot dogs to your cookout? And whether or not how much value you provide or how much of value assigned to your friends and family based on your food choices. Lastly, an important aspect that we see come up time and again is personality. So things like willingness to try new food, fear of food technology, and also willingness to reduce animal consumption are some common personality factors that have been associated with sensory acceptance of alternative proteins. But there's a lot more of this information in the report, but also a special report put out by GFI if you're interested on this consumer insights. So now we're going to lead on to facts and recommendations, and I'm going to start with asking some common questions that came up in part of the interviews, and also common questions that we see often in the industry. And so we might commonly get asked the question of, can I use instrumentation to guide understanding of sensory perception? And Nikki alluded to this earlier. While instrumentation is really common for product developers to turn to, such as HPLC or texture analysis, this can be really valuable to guiding the development and selection of specific ingredients. But it is clear that it is sensory science is really the most powerful tool to be making business decisions. And so if you're, it can be useful to provide early feedback, but there's no replacement of human experience and making sure that you're always including um, your target audience. So the interviewees agreed that while instruments can reliable measure certain physical parameters, they are poor predictors of sensory experiences. So another really common question that we get, and you can kind of see throughout, I've mentioned when we might be interested in using employees for sensory studies. So employees can be used for market profiling of the available market space. You might want to get some internal feedback on prototypes. They can be used for trained panels. However, there was concerns around accessibility to your panel members. It can be great to be using for quality assurance or narrowing down on specific prototypes. However, it's crucial to not use employees when seeking data that involves liking, hedonic, or acceptability, or anything as determined as final measures for versions for launch. So really making sure you're getting your target consumer audience. We also might be concerned about how important is it to understand consumer segmentation. Um, Based on the literature and talking with interviewees, we think that consumer segmentation is more important when thinking about alternative protein space because of the current industry and shifting away from conventional animal meat. So understanding consumer segmentation can be extremely valuable in certain contexts, but is not always necessary for every step of the way during development. So segmentation can be most useful when the company wants to identify how specific consumer groups trying to get into new untouched consumer market, um, and also to make sure that your product is going to be well liked within a specific space. So this question, we're going to end with this question of, is it essential for alternative proteins to achieve sensory parity? And again, while we have maybe differences in the definition of sensory parity across our interviewees, um, you might want to consider that sensory parity is an alternative product that is indistinguishable from an animal-based counterpart. It is regarded as the most effective approach to drive mainstream consumer adoption by meeting consumers where they are. At the same time, sensory parity is widely regarded as experts as being an unrealistic goal for alternative protein products given the current technology. However, investment must be made to advance the technology, and there are practical considerations that will influence sensory evaluation in the meantime. So for sensory parity, making sure that it aligns with your company goals, whether that be aligning with a leading animal counterpart or alternative protein. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over for Nikki to wrap up for our session today.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for that overview of some of the highlights of the report. If you take away just three things from today, we want to cover our key recommendations here. So first is that investment in sensory science supports confident, consumer-relevant product decisions. And while we acknowledge that it's a true investment, like Alyssa said, one expert cited about 3,000 per product for each of 50 consumers, putting a typical study in the tens of thousands for effective testing. There are cost realities, of course, and many companies rely on internal participants, which is acceptable for early stage prototyping and directional insights. But when the goal is robust, consumer relevant insights, external participants are strongly recommended despite that higher cost. These higher costs provide the rigorous data to drive business decisions and can be offset by commercial performance, and also often far more economical than the ramifications of a failed product. Second is that effective sensory testing is not a one size fits all. First, it's very important to clearly articulate what you want to know or learn, as that's the foundation of any successful sensory study. And then choosing the right tool and the right participants is a must. The participant profile and sample size must match the goal, a risk, and complexity of the decision at hand. And again, consumers are essential for liking and market success. And last is that first impressions matter. So poor early experiences with alternative proteins can negatively shape consumer perceptions of the category. And so investing in sensory science early and often is important for the category as a whole. So looking ahead, we see this field of sensory science and alternative proteins particularly evolving rapidly. We're seeing much more multimodal approaches that use things like facial coding, eye tracking, and other things to capture subconscious reactions in addition to our typical sensory methods. And also technologies like virtual reality or augmented reality, helping to simulate real-world eating contexts while still in a controlled environment. We also find that current research focuses more on static methods, and more is needed to understand the temporal and dynamic evaluation of alternative proteins. So that will help build an understanding of the eating experience over time, which definitely changes, such as raw and cooked aroma, flavor, and texture. And critically, we also need to expand research to more temporal, or sorry, beyond the weird sort of so-called demographic, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations to understand the global consumer. So we hope this report will serve as motivation and a guide to build sensory literacy on your team. And to continue building this capability, we have the following recommendations. So first is building awareness through internal seminars. Second is identifying sensory leads to coordinate the efforts. Next, maybe starting small with a simple blinded taste test or flash profiling to build intuition and capability. After that, training for more rigorous sensory methods, focusing on repeatability and consistency rather than just conformity. Next is formally integrating these checkpoints into your product development timeline to guide decision making. And finally, investing in continued learning through inviting in experts, engaging in external courses and conferences. And to that end, we have several resources and opportunities for further learning. Here are some regular conferences, publications, courses and methods, as well as sensory software to get you started and to dive in deeper. And we've also updated our list of industry consultants to include sensory and consumer testing consultants, as bringing in an expert is probably one of the best things that you can do. So you can check it out here, along with the full reports. Again, we have the full white paper that's very in-depth, as well as the shorter quick start guide that we hope will serve as a printable reference for teams on the go, postable in offices or labs, or easily shareable and digestible. And last, please stay tuned for more on this topic through the GFI newsletters and seminar series. We'll be building on this theme with some upcoming webinars next year through our Science of Alt Protein and Business of Alt Protein series. And so with that, thank you so much for tuning in, and we are happy to take your questions. Okay, we'll start with the first question that came through. What methods are best to analyze data when you are limited to 6 panelists? We have internal and external needs for this. So Claire gave some initial notes in the chat. I think Alyssa will have some insights as well. We do have a piece in the white paper that recommends doing multiple duplicates, particularly for discrimination testing for better power. This, of course, comes with caveats. Employees are typically way more sensitive and in tune with product changes. You can also do some rapid methods, but always know that consumer data is needed regardless for effective testing. And yeah, I'll hand off to Alyssa if there's anything I'm sure you want to add there.
Yeah, all of these methods, the QDA method and the spectrum method they're both gone into detail in the report. It really is recommended, 8 to 12 of your highly trained participants for this step. The risk of including too few individuals, there could be concerns that they're going to miss differences when they're on fact differences. So it really is around how much confidence do you have in the data that you have. So things like repeating could help, um, but essentially it would be the equivalent of, your trained panel is supposed to perform like an instrument. And so when you have something like an HPLC, running your experiment 6 more times might help a little bit in terms of narrowing down your values. But there can be risk in having too few participants in trained panel evaluation. But it is very important to ensure calibration. So you need to be able to demonstrate reliability. And so including calibration as frequently as possible and ensure that they are performing consistently and reliability can help if you truly only have six. But really the best practice is to have closer to 10 to 12.
Thank you. There's another question on what are panelist thresholds for effective tests?
Yeah, so I think this question might refer to, is there like a minimum number that you should reach on your 9-point hedonic scale to ensure that your product is going to be successful in the marketplace? So this is going to be company dependent, and some great best practices are actually go look through your previous history and to be able to show um, in the last 2 years, our leading product is X. And before we launched, we had a value of 6 on a hedonic scale, for example, to be able to show that there's some support to be able to, okay, is 6 sufficient? Do we need a 6.5? Do we need a 7 to be able to show that our product is going to be successful in the marketplace? Some companies might have a set threshold across the board, and that might be around a 6.7, a 6.5, or a 7. And anything less than a 6.5 will go back to the drawing board, so to speak. But being able to have more concrete evidence and being able to track that over time would be best practice for each company. But if you're a new company and you don't have that data, best practice is really going to be comparing that to a commercial product or your benchmark rather than relying on a specific score.
Thanks. The next one was what are some of the best and cheapest tools for organizing a panel, i.e., generating random codes and serving order or organizing data? And we do have that list of resources at the end of the white paper and also in the slides. Um, just from our own personal experiences, I know just Google Forms is a good start if you're really strapped and need a way to collect data in a standardized way. But those sensory software recommendations will help with code, serving order, and interpreting data. And I'm sure Alyssa has some further recommendations.
Yep, there are some cheap and expensive strategies. However, there could be some additional benefit from investing in a sensory software, like data analysis tools and visualization tools, but also panel management and things like that. But there's certainly inexpensive ways to doing all of these things. But if you're really looking at investment in a sensory software, some leading examples are given in the guide. But CompuSense is my personal what I would use. But there's also great ones like Red Jade and Fizz, as well as some other examples.
Awesome. I'll give this next one to you as well. I think the one about demographic representation was answered in the chat, so we can skip that. But in your experience, what are the quantitative KPIs you'd recommend companies use before a market launch? Just to clarify, what are quantitative KPIs you'd recommend companies use to determine whether their product is ready for a market launch?
So that is a great question. I think the previous question around setting a specific um, threshold for hedonic study, I think traditionally that is what companies might rely on is making sure they have a specific value in mind. But really, overall liking is going to be a key indicator of whether or not your product is ready to launch. And again, making sure you have that compared to a reliable control or benchmark. Other questions you might want to really think about more a marketing or consumer insights, thinking about willingness to purchase, purchase intent, those sorts of questions aligning with your overall liking for a product. And this is that overlap between sensory science and consumer science. That's a great opportunity for them to intersect.
Awesome, thank you. So the next one is, what do you recommend to reduce variability over time of an individual panelist or participant? Should test participants be recalibrated to maintain consistency? Is this a substantive problem in practice? I think this is more geared towards the descriptive methods where, yes, calibration is very important, mostly for consistency across sessions. And we discussed that a little bit in the guide, but I'll let Alyssa speak to what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and is a valid concern when running descriptive analysis. You definitely want, especially you're going to maintain your panel and be evaluating products over time. You definitely want to make sure that you have um, traditional products or products that are very reliable, you know that they're going to be consistently produced and making sure that they're performing in a similar manner, both across within an individual and across individuals, and making sure you regularly do this with your participant group. And that's going to be really important for making decisions based on the data that they provide from your prototypes or your existing products. So I hopefully that um, answer helps to address the question, but it's really going to be, very frequent um, hours of investment of not only training but recalibrating your panelist group.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the next one is, how do you define unbiased consumers? So broadly, those not familiar with the product or the brand, but within the target market. So definitely excluding employees, stakeholders, and those that might have perceptions. So to that end, you can include screening questions in your effective testing to make sure that you are looking at a subset of unbiased consumers and you have that information for later analysis. Um, but yeah, that's how we're thinking about unbiased consumers. Do you want to add anything, Alyssa? Should we move on?
I think that's excellent. To be to thinking about who you might exclude when you're assessing liking, and just really anyone has something to gain from the product for being successful, or maybe a lot more familiarity with the product than your average consumer. So those would be kind of something maybe to add, but that is really important when designing your sensory study is who is your participant.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, the next one is, how do you think through efficient testing for products with one main prep method like nuggets versus multi-prep use ingredients versus ground? So I think this is addressed kind of in our section on ingredient evaluation. So in general, recommend starting with very plain undressed ingredient or product, then working up to more and more complex evaluations like in context evaluations where the product is for a ground product, for example, formed into a meatball and served on spaghetti with sauce, for example. But you want to work up to there slowly and make sure that the product stands alone first. And with the one main prep method or multi-prep use ingredients, I think that same principle still applies whether you're serving it alone or if it's a nugget with a sauce, for example. Anything you want to add there, Alyssa?
It's actually a very complex problem too, because it's, are you interested in descriptive analysis or are you interested in overall liking and thinking about who you're trying to get that information from? If you're really thinking about development, I think Nikki's example is a great. But if you're thinking about as on the consumer side and you're asking them to prepare a product using the ingredient, that is an important aspect because, going to like a traditional booth setting and having a product already made for you is a little bit different than if you're buying the product at a retail store and you're preparing it at home. So that's where you might get into the difference of a central location test and thinking about a home use test. So it really is going to be dependent on where you are in your development space and the information that you want to get from that. Um, and you're most likely going to need a lot more investment in sensory if you're thinking about we need to have um, all the steps along the way versus a ingredient by itself versus when it's used in something. So a great example is plant-based cheese. You can have someone make you a grilled cheese, but thinking about how you make a pizza at home obviously is a great example of when you might need to be investing in both a central location test and a home use test. Or there's an opportunity to work with chefs, which is described in our report as well, thinking about if you're selling an ingredient for a chef to be using in a restaurant, that also would have its own implications and sensory insights as well.
Thanks. I'm gonna kick this next question over to you. So what's the level of significance recommended in QDA while comparing an animal control with plant-based prototypes? Is it recommended to add a negative control to close the gap in perceived differences?
So I think it would be great if we had like a little bit more detail for the question, but traditionally if your goal is really to be able to match that animal counterpart, you really want to show that there's no difference in that specific attribute between your prototype, for example, and the conventional animal benchmark that you have in the study. Um, for a trained panel, you really don't need to include a negative control. Um, but if you have concerns around their reliability and performance, but it's not really going to address your question of, level of significance. So really including a negative control would be really about performance of your panel. And so if you're thinking about the significance level of your statistical tests, we usually do have the alpha set to 0.05 for any comparisons that you're going to be doing across the specific attribute that you have. And I hope if I misinterpreted your question, please, if you're still on, you can re-ask your question, but that's how I would have responded to as I understand.
Thanks, Alyssa. And since we're on the topic of panels and descriptive analysis, how do you calibrate the 8 to 12 sensory panelists to check their performance?
That is a great question. So there's a little bit differences between a QDA and a spectrum method, but essentially, once you have a list of specific attributes that you're interested in, and I'm just going to take sweetness because it's really easy to discuss. But if you think about rating the intensity of sweetness for a beverage, you can think about like a lemonade. You're going to have reference standards for what does it mean for an intensity of a 1 versus an intensity of a 5 in terms of overall sweetness. And so you would calibrate your group so that if you gave them a concentrated solution of sugar and water, you'd be able to say, okay, a 0.5 molar solution, this is about 12% sucrose solution, which is the equivalent for those of you who are interested to like a can of Coke. That when they had this solution that its intensity is a 5, for example, on an intensity scale, and you can produce a range of references all the way down across the intensities or concentrations of sucrose from very intense all the way down to a very low concentration of sucrose in water. And so you can provide these references or standards to your group and do this performance over time. And so essentially, what you want to be able to see is if I give an unknown sucrose solution to my panelists, every panelist will be marking that on the same intensity scale across everyone. And so you can see reliability, and then you can do this over sessions. And so if you have a very specific attribute that you're interested, and some of these attributes can be very challenging to work with, especially if you think about, first bite versus chewing versus swallowing, but making sure that they are performing reliably. So there are standard references that you can use um, for specific attributes that you're interested in, but sucrose is a very easy one to describe. But so you want to be able to do that repeatedly with your panel very often to make sure that they're reliable. So if you're running an internal panel for something like this, you probably have invested in a sensory software tool. Most of these commercial software tools actually have an option for giving feedback. So imagine if you're doing a quick check, if a panelist isn't performing adequately, they've rated the intensity lower than it should, higher than it should be, it'll actually give that feedback for that participant, helping them to better improve their ratings moving forward.
Thanks, Alyssa. Okay, so this next one, I'm not sure I completely am getting the question, but it says, you compared data between meat burgers and vegetable burgers between consumers and panelists.
Yeah, so I think if I can also provide my thoughts on this question of can you compare the data that you collect with descriptive analysis with effective testing, considering that they're different groups of people? And yes, you absolutely can. You can actually be able to say, well, if I have the same exact product and I've done my descriptive profiling and now I've run a separate study, that same product, and now I've assessed liking, you can actually ask that question of, um, my product didn't perform as I liked. It has a low liking score, but what of these specific attributes might be driving that low liking? And provide opportunities to say, where should I be improving? Um, the the method that you might consider using is called penalty lift analysis. You can see how much sweetness or how much metallic, how much chewiness do I need to modify to be able to have an improvement in my liking. So that's one example of how you might use or combine data sets to be able to make some directionality between descriptive profiling and overall liking. So I think hopefully that helps to address that question.
Thanks, yeah. Okay, and last question. For very radical products where it's not defined which group of consumers we should test, what is a strategic sensory approach?
That can be very challenging, right? If you have maybe an undefined group of consumers. I mean, if money's not an option, you really want to be getting as many consumers in to test your product as possible, hopefully at multiple different locations to be able to identify who would be a good group. And in running that study, identifying what about those specific individuals definitely can be very challenging. However, if you run a small group in a specific location, you might find one result, which might not translate to a different demographic. Um, I think it could actually be very useful to think about running a prototype in a large online survey. And so in this case, you wouldn't have a specific product for people to try, but try to identify a large number of people. Maybe it's 1,000, maybe it's 2,000 in an online setting where you're presenting a hypothetical product to be able to identify um, of these 2,000 people, we had 500 people who liked it. What are the characteristics of those 500 people that might be worth investigating as this should be our target audience? So I think that's the approach that I might use. And again, someone else might use a different approach. But if it's, yeah, a very radical product, that first step, an investment in that might be a good strategy to identify a potential group of individuals that you might want to target your product.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that tuned in. We so appreciate you spending a little time with us today. And please do download the resources and get in touch if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.